Nobody in Hardin County, Tennessee expected a 16-year-old boy to walk into the First Agricultural Bank on a Tuesday morning in March of 1974 with a typed loan application in a manila folder. Nobody expected what he did 12 years later either. The two things are connected, though not in the way you might assume, not in the way of revenge, not in the way of settling scores, in a way that is quieter than that and more final. The boy's name was Cass Delray. He was the second oldest of 5 children of a tenant farmer named Wilton Delray, who worked 80 acres of bottomland in Hardin County, Tennessee, for a share arrangement that left the family solvent in good years and close to the edge in bad ones. Cass had a typed loan application in a manila folder and $140 in a savings account at the same bank, and a business plan for a produce operation that he had written out by hand and then retyped twice on the family's Underwood typewriter over the course of 3 evenings in February. He had made an appointment. The appointment was with a loan officer named Mr. Gerald Bray, who had been with First Agricultural Bank since 1961, and who had a corner office on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the Savannah Town Square. Gerald Bray had been told by the receptionist that his 9 o'clock was a boy from one of the tenant farming families east of town. He had taken the appointment because declining it would have been rude. He laughed when Cass Delray sat down across the desk from him and opened the manila folder. Not immediately. He looked at the application first, which showed more preparation than he had expected. He looked at the business plan, which showed more thought than he had expected. He looked at the savings account documentation, which showed $140, which was not enough for what the boy was asking. And then he laughed. It was a short laugh, not mean-spirited, not loud, the kind of laugh that escapes a person when something surprises them as absurd. He recovered quickly and told the boy in professional language what the bank required for a small business loan and why the application as submitted did not meet those requirements. Cass Delray thanked him. He collected his papers. He left. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. Savannah is the county seat of Hardin County, which sits in the southwestern corner of Tennessee along the Tennessee River. Farming country mixed with timber and a little commerce, the kind of place where the economy runs on what the land produces and what the river allows, and what the people who stayed decided to build after the people who left decided to go. In 1974, the town had about 6,000 people and the usual furniture of a county seat: the courthouse, a hardware store, 2 diners, a John Deere dealership, and the First Agricultural Bank on the northeast corner of the square, which had been there since 1934 and which was the primary agricultural lending institution for the county. If you farmed in Hardin County and needed operating capital, you went to First Agricultural Bank. If you needed a mortgage, you went to First Agricultural Bank. There was a savings and loan in the east part of town and a branch of a Chattanooga bank that had opened in 1971. But for agricultural lending, farm operating loans, equipment financing, land mortgages for agricultural property, First Agricultural was the institution. This was not a monopoly in any legal sense. It was just a fact of local financial geography, the kind of fact that accumulates quietly over 40 years, and that no one spends much time thinking about because it is simply the way things are. Gerald Bray had been with First Agricultural since 1961. He had a corner office on the 2nd floor with a window looking out over the square, and from that window he had watched the town change slowly in the way small county seat towns change. A new business coming, an old one closing, the courthouse getting a new roof in 1969, the hardware store owner retiring in 1972, and his son taking over and running it exactly the same. He was not an unkind man. He was a man with 23 years of agricultural lending experience and a clear internal model of what a bankable agricultural proposition looked like and what it did not look like. And a 16-year-old boy from a share tenant family with $140 in savings did not look like it. The laugh had not been cruelty. It had been the involuntary response of a man whose internal model had been surprised by something that did not fit. A woman named Edith Morse, who had been a teller at First Agricultural since 1968, was working the window nearest the stairs that Tuesday morning. She could not hear what was said in Gerald Bray's office. The office was upstairs and the door was closed. But she saw the boy come down the stairs when he left. She said she remembered it because of how he came down. Not fast, not visibly upset, just deliberate. Like the thinking was happening, and the thinking required a specific pace. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and adjusted the papers in his manila folder, and then walked out the front door without looking at the teller windows. She did not think about it again for a long time. It was a Tuesday morning in March. She had work to do. Wilton Delray, Cass's father, had not come from a farming family in the traditional sense. He had grown up in Memphis and come to Hardin County in 1955 when he was 22 years old, following a woman he later married, and had learned to farm by a combination of necessity and neighbor instruction that left him functional but not masterful. He was a careful man and a hard worker, but his knowledge of farming was the kind acquired in adulthood, thorough in the practical mechanics, and thin in the accumulated intuition that comes only from being born into it. What Wilton had brought from Memphis, however, was a different kind of knowledge. He had worked for 3 years in the accounting department of a mid-sized cotton brokerage before leaving for Hardin County, and he had spent those 3 years learning, in practical terms, how money moved through an agricultural enterprise, how the costs of a crop season were financed, when the debt was taken on and when it was retired, what the margin looked like at the end of a good year and what it looked like at the end of a bad one, where the value was in the chain between grower and buyer, and what the grower typically captured versus what he gave away. He had kept this knowledge the way a person keeps something they're not sure when they'll need, quietly, not displayed, accessible when the time came. He had talked to Cass about it since Cass was old enough to understand what he was saying. Not as formal instruction, not with textbooks or ledgers or exercises. As conversation, usually in the evenings, sitting on the porch in summer or at the kitchen table in winter, talking about how the share arrangement worked and why the math came out the way it did, and what a person would have to do differently to capture a larger portion of what they grew. Wilton was not bitter about the share arrangement. It was what it was, and it had kept the family fed, but he was clear-eyed about it. He talked about it the way a man talks about a thing he understands precisely and accepts practically, without pretending it is something other than what it is. Cass had listened. He was a listener by nature, quieter than most boys his age, more inclined to observe than to speak. The kind of child who gets described as serious and who usually is. He had listened to his father talk about money and margins and the structure of agricultural finance since he was 8 or 9 years old. And by the time he was 16, he had a working understanding of how value was created and captured in a farming economy that most adults in Hardin County, including Gerald Bray, did not have in the same form. The loan application he carried into First Agricultural Bank in March of 1974 was for $2,200. He wanted to lease 3 acres of bottomland from a neighbor, put it into sweet corn, tomatoes, and pole beans, and sell the produce to a distributor he had identified in Jackson, Tennessee, who was paying above the local farm gate price for fresh vegetables in the summer months. He had calculated the seed costs, the fertilizer costs, the fuel for irrigation, the labor cost, his own, and the projected revenue against the distributor's published buying price schedule, which he had obtained by writing the company a letter on paper he had taken from the school supply closet and typing it on the Underwood and mailing it from the post office in his own envelope with a stamp he had bought with his own money. The distributor had written back with a price sheet. He had attached it to the business plan. Gerald Bray had looked at the price sheet. He had noted that the boy had obtained it. He had laughed anyway, because $140 in savings and a shared tenant's son and 3 acres of bottom ground did not, in Gerald Bray's 23 years of agricultural lending experience, add up to a bankable proposition regardless of what the paperwork said. Cass was not wrong about the numbers. He was wrong about the audience. He went back to the farm and found another way. The neighbor whose 3 acres he had planned to lease, a man named Hugh Fielder, who grew burley tobacco on 60 acres east of town, and who had watched Cass work since the boy was 12, agreed to a different arrangement after Cass explained what he had in mind. Hugh would provide the land. Cass would provide the labor, the planning, and the sales. The net proceeds, revenue minus the seed, fertilizer, and irrigation fuel costs, would split 60-40 in Cass's favor. Hugh would front the input costs from his own cash, which the tobacco operation provided reliably, and recover them from the first proceeds before the split. No bank, no loan officer, no manila folder. Hugh Fielder agreed partly because he trusted Cass's work ethic, which he had observed for 4 years, and partly because 3 acres of bottomland that would otherwise grow weeds in the summer months was not a significant risk, and partly because the 40% he would keep from a well-run vegetable operation on ground he wasn't using represented found money. He did not know at the time that Cass had approached him only after being turned down at the bank. Cass had not mentioned it. He did not mention it now. The first season, summer of 1974, Cass planted sweet corn in the first acre, mixed tomatoes and pole beans in the second, and a late planting of winter squash in the third to extend the revenue window into September. He worked the ground himself from May through early October, getting up before school let out for the summer and working until dark, and continued through the school year by managing what needed managing and letting the crops do what crops do when they have been planted right and the weather cooperates. The weather cooperated. The Jackson distributor paid the prices listed on the price sheet. The season netted $1,840 after Hugh's input costs were recovered. Cass's 60% share was $1,104. He deposited it in his savings account at First Agricultural Bank in October of 1974. Nobody at the bank connected the deposit to the boy who had come in with a manila folder in March. He ran the operation for 3 full seasons. Each year, he refined the crop mix based on what the Jackson distributor was paying premium prices for versus what was moving at commodity rates. Expanding tomatoes, which commanded 23 cents per pound at the distributor versus 14 cents at the farm gate, and pulling back on sweet corn, which the distributor wanted in quantity but paid less premium on. He kept a ledger in a spiral notebook, a habit from watching his father keep farm records, tracking input costs by crop, revenue by crop, and margin by crop across the 3 acres in 3 seasons. By the end of the 1976 season, his savings account held $4,217, and he had 3 years of documented produce operation results in the notebook. He went back to First Agricultural Bank in October of 1976. He asked to see a loan officer. He brought the notebook. He was assigned to a man named Paul Rutherford, who had joined the bank in 1975 and who did not have Gerald Bray's 23 years of Hardin County lending experience, and therefore did not have Gerald Bray's fixed model of what a bankable proposition looked like. Paul Rutherford looked at 3 years of produce operation ledgers showing consistent positive margins, a savings account balance of $4,217, and a 19-year-old with a documented track record of running a small agricultural enterprise without borrowed capital. He approved the loan for $6,000 at 9.5%. He was 19 years old. He used the loan to lease 12 acres from 2 different landowners, expanding beyond Hugh Fielder's 3 acres, though he kept that relationship and ran it for 2 more years, and put the additional ground into the crop mix he had refined over 3 seasons. By 1979, he was running 35 acres of mixed vegetables across 4 leased parcels, had a truck he had paid $1,900 for outright, and had established direct supply relationships with 3 restaurant accounts in Jackson and a produce wholesaler in Memphis, the same city his father had come from, which was not an accident and which Cass did not make a point of to anyone. He knew the Memphis wholesale market because Wilton had described it from the inside, 20 years before, in the way of a man who had been inside something long enough to understand it. Cass had built toward it for 6 years. He incorporated the operation in 1980 as Delray Produce, LLC. He hired 2 full-time workers in the 1981 season, which was his first year with a payroll. He bought the first parcel of land he had ever owned, 18 acres in the bottomland east of Savannah, in 1983 at $320 per acre, a total of $5,760, with a mortgage from First Agricultural Bank that Gerald Bray's successor signed off on without irony and probably without remembering the Tuesday in March 9 years before. The First Agricultural Bank of Hardin County closed in February of 1985. It was not the only small agricultural bank that closed in the mid-1980s. The farm credit crisis of that decade was a regional and national event, the product of falling commodity prices, rising interest rates, and a decade of over-leveraged expansion that came due all at once. But it closed in Hardin County specifically, on the northeast corner of the square, the building that had been there since 1934. The Resolution Trust worked through the assets over the following months. Gerald Bray had retired in 1983, 2 years before the closure, which meant he was sitting on a pension when the institution he had worked for since 1961 went under, which was better than the alternative and which he was probably aware of. The building sat empty through most of 1985 and into the early months of 1986. A 2-story brick structure on the square that had been well maintained and was structurally sound, and that nobody in Hardin County had yet made a move to purchase, because the Resolution Trust process was slow and the terms were not fully settled until the spring. By 1986, Delray Produce was running more than $400,000 in annual revenue. Cass had 80 leased acres across 6 parcels and was farming 40 of his own, employed 7 full-time workers and a variable number of seasonal hands, and was operating with a Peterbilt straight truck he had bought the previous year for $34,000 to handle the Memphis wholesale runs without the cost of a hired carrier. The business had outgrown the shed on the home farm. He needed a warehouse with loading dock access and an office with space for a second desk and a filing room. And he had been looking at commercial properties in Savannah for 2 years without finding anything at a price and location that suited the operation. The First Agricultural Bank building had a loading bay access on the north side, added in the 1960s when the bank had taken on a small agricultural supply function it later dropped. It had a ground floor that could be cleared and fitted for produce storage and cold holding with modest renovation. It had a second floor that already contained offices. It was on the square, which meant it was visible and accessible. It was priced by the Resolution Trust at $41,000, below assessed value, which was itself below the building's value in its years of active operation. Cass Delray bought it in April of 1986. He signed the papers at the Resolution Trust's temporary office in a rented space down the block from the square, not in the building itself, which was already his by the time he walked through the front door for the second time as the owner rather than the applicant. He did not make a speech about it. He signed the papers and paid the transfer fee and moved Delray Produce's warehouse and office operation into the building over the following 3 weeks. He put a sign on the north entrance that said, Delray Produce in plain block letters, and did not put anything on the front of the building where the bank's name had been, because the front of the building was where the Resolution Trust had stripped the signage and left the brick clean, and he did not see a reason to cover clean brick. Edith Morse was still at the bank, a different branch in a different building by then, when she heard through the county grapevine that the Delray boy had bought the old First Agricultural building. She thought about it for a few days. She thought about the Tuesday morning in March of 1974, the boy coming down the stairs, adjusting the papers in his manila folder, walking out the front door without looking at the teller windows. She had wondered sometimes what he had been thinking at that moment. She thought she probably knew or could guess close enough. She was probably right. Cass Delray, when I asked him about it many years later over coffee at the diner on the Savannah Square, said he did not remember the walk down the stairs particularly clearly. He remembered the loan application. He remembered the number, $2,200. He remembered the price sheet from the Jackson distributor, which he had sent for with his own stamp on his own envelope. He remembered Gerald Bray looking at the price sheet. He said the thing he thought about most, looking back, was not Gerald Bray. He said he thought about Wilton Delray, sitting on the porch in summer, or at the kitchen table in winter, talking through the math of the share arrangement in the tone of a man who had accepted the situation precisely as it was, without pretending it was different, showing his son where the value went and why, and leaving the question of what to do about it entirely open, the way good questions get left. Cass had done something about it, quietly, over 12 years, without announcing any of it at any stage. That was the whole of the story in his telling. The building on the square was not a trophy. It was a warehouse and an office. He needed a warehouse and an office. He said this in a tone that left just enough space for the listener to decide whether to believe it entirely. He smiled when he said it, a small, contained smile, the kind that a private man allows himself when he is being more honest than he intends. He picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the square. The northeast corner was right there. 4 windows on the second floor, the same brick, the loading bay on the north side. Delray Produce, in plain block letters on the entrance. He did not say anything else about it. He didn't need to.